The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. As Wisconsin's winter bears inexorably down upon us, it's easy to feel thoroughly detached from all things tropical. Our guests today, however, spend their time exploring the connection between tropical ecosystems and conditions on the rest of the planet. Unlike Vegas, it seems, what happens in the tropical rainforest doesn't stay in the rainforest. To help us understand how all things tropical are increasingly topical even in these northern latitudes, we're joined by three researchers from UWM's Department of Biological Sciences. Stefan Schnitzer is professor in the department, where his research involves the ecology of plant communities and the ways species compete, regenerate, and coexist. He's joined today by two members of his research team. Sergio Estrada-Villegas is a PhD student who is measuring how competition between plants affects carbon dynamics in the forest. David DeFilippis is developing wireless technology that could be deployed in forests around the world to help measure precise tree and liana growth. His initial field tests are scheduled for Panama. Well, welcome everyone to International Focus.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering if we could start with sort of Rainforest 101 and why, for example, rainforests are sometimes called the lungs of the world. What is that about?
Well, that's a great question. You may have noticed over the last decade or so that the weather patterns here are starting to change. It's getting a little hotter and drier in the summertime. And a lot of those weather patterns are global patterns. And a lot of the weather we're seeing, especially the more severe weather, is driven by the accumulation of greenhouse gases. One of the important greenhouse gases is carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, but a lot of it is being processed through what you're calling the lungs of the planet. Tropical forests store about 1/3 of all of the carbon on the planet that's in terrestrial form, right? And that's stored in wood. Basically, the wood in the big trees in the tropics are holding this carbon. And when they die, they release the carbon slowly. But these forests also have really high productivity, so they're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And carbon in the atmosphere mixes globally pretty quickly. So if you have these lungs, these forests that are pulling carbon out and storing it in wood, then it's not in the atmosphere raising the temperature and creating more intense storms. And so the connection between the tropics and the temperate zone is pretty clear in the weather that we see.
So what do we mean then by a carbon sink? We hear that term.
Well, basically, it means that as plants are able to do what people know as photosynthesis, they're actually capturing that CO2 that is floating up in the air, and they're turning it into biomass. So it's just forest as a whole. You just imagine a huge accumulation of trees, really big trees, are just taking the CO2 from the atmosphere and they're turning it into biomass, into trunks, and they're increasing their sizes. So sink meaning that you have a place where CO2 is being released, cars, trucks, transportation, fire, all these sources of CO2, of carbon dioxide, being released. These gases get mixed in the atmosphere, and then tropical forests end up being the sink. They're just capturing it and storing them and hoping that, we hope that it stays there for a long period of time.
So historically then, the net effect is they're capturing carbon. Now, is there ever a possibility that the forest could become a net contributor of carbon?
Exactly, yeah, it actually happens. It happens in a sense when, for example, you have massive deforestation and fire follows the deforestation. So first of all, you're getting rid of the wood and you're doing something with it, and parts of it are just being burnt. And so in a sense, the transformation of the forests is actually producing the CO2, but forests themselves are rarely a source of carbon. It's usually just the opposite. It's actually their sink of the atmospheric carbon.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of tropical forests. Tropical forests have really high productivity, meaning they're pulling a lot of carbon out of the air. And at a certain point, they're neither a source nor a sink. They're at a stable state. They're basically releasing as much CO2 as they're pulling in, right? But when you start, as Sergio said, when you start deforesting, then they actually become a source. Then when they start to regenerate again, they become a sink. They're actually storing much more carbon. So carbon is what we're talking about here, and that's either in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, or it's in the form of wood. Basically, well, there's lots of different forms of carbon, but the plants, when they photosynthesize, they're creating sugars, which is carbon, and then they grow, and that's when you see them getting bigger and bigger, and all that carbon is stored in the trunks. Tropical trees can live for 1,000 years each, and they can be enormous, and that's what's storing most of the carbon. And when you compare those to temperate forests have a much shorter growing season, and their total girth doesn't get as large. So temperate forests are very expansive, and there's a lot of them, but they don't have as fast the turnover rate that tropical forests do. So as we emit more CO2 into the atmosphere, it's the tropics that become really important in their ability to pull that carbon out of the air really quickly. Up here in Wisconsin, most of the plants, especially during this time of year, they're not pulling much carbon out of the air at all because they're completely dormant.
So if the overall climate is changing, presumably there's an ideal climate for these tropical plants to thrive in. We think of deforestation as the big threat. Is the change in the climate in which they have to exist a threat to the forest?
You know, that's a fascinating question, because for years and years, people thought that the tropics were buffered from the large-scale climatic changes that we're seeing. You know, when people talk about global warming, really the warming that's occurring is happening most intensely at the poles, where you're seeing huge amounts of ice melt, and the poles are changing rapidly, where everyone thought, oh, well, the tropics are buffered, they're in the middle.
Nothing is going to change.
But what we're seeing now are some fairly large shifts in the relative contribution of different plant types. And that's really important, because some of those plant types, like trees, store a lot of carbon, and then the other ones that are really common are the woody vines, and they can be enormous plants, and they climb up into these trees, and they can stretch for half a kilometer from tree crown to tree crown. They can go through 30 to 50 trees. But what they do is they keep trees from growing. And when they keep trees from growing, they actually reduce the carbon storage capacity of tropical forests. So this is a very big thing right now, because we're seeing this shift in the relative composition of trees in relation to vines. And as vines increase, the carbon storage capacity begins to decrease in these tropical forests.
And what about just location? Do species migrate? I mean, if it's too hot in one place or too cold, can you see the where they grow change?
Well, it actually happens. Yeah. So for mobile species like birds or bats, people are starting to see that they're actually shifting their ranges. People in the mountains in the tropical, I would say Panama or Colombia or Ecuador, are actually finding species, bird species that usually would not migrate through altitude, and now they're finding them higher and higher because it's warmer and warmer at higher altitudes. So for animals, it's all right. But for plants, the story is a bit different. So in areas where climate is shifting, well, their transition is certainly going to be much lower, and probably we're not going to be able to track it through time. But Stefan is right. As climate is changing in some areas, the type of plants are able to grow also changes. So what we thought for 50 or 60 years, what the norm was, is actually not going to be so in the next 50 years, because the climate is changing so quickly. We don't know yet if plants are going to be able to track this change either fast enough, and how these compositions are going to also affect, let's say, the carbon balance of the world.
Right, and so we do know that if you look at the population of a species and it's spread out over some geographic range, that the southernmost population, say in the northern latitudes, is going to be a little bit different than those plants of the same species growing up in the northern area. And so what everyone assumed is that the southern ones, everything would just shift northward. The problem with that is we've fragmented the landscape quite a bit. And so many of those plants can't move because the environment in which they live in is no longer there. So there are some obstacles to this ideal shift of plants.
It's a little bit like salmon not being able to spawn because there's a dam in the way or something. Okay.
Exactly.
So what is the effect of these sort of larger environmental issues? How do those threats compare to just the straight out clear cutting to graze cattle? And what, on balance, what is the bigger threat?
Wow. All right. Well, I think, let's just first talk about the benefit. I mean, we have direct benefits from, let's say, cattle, which we have the meat and we have the milk, and so they're direct products there that we all value and cherish, right? But the first direct loss would say, first of all, biodiversity itself. If you don't have a habitat for species to survive, then they're gone. And that's why it's been talked in many different forums by many different, people all over the world saying this is a massive extinction because we're just destroying the habitat for the species. So that's one thing. So once we turn the forest into pasture, we're just losing habitat, first of all. And second of all, we're losing the capacity of the habitat to keep on functioning as they used to do. So one part would be the soil changes, right? So layers of soil that were deposited because the forest was there, they're going to go because the rain is going to wash out that soil. And second of all, turning back to carbon, there's not much carbon in the grass compared to a lush tropical forest.
And probably a fair amount that gets released by the animals, right?
Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
Yeah, good point. Exactly.
You see it in Africa too. On the continent of Africa, as the Sahara Desert creeps farther south into the rainforest due to, slash and burn and grazing brings that desertification farther down into the rainforest, and then you don't have areas between, savannas to tropics. You don't have a gradation. You just have desert, rainforest, and as they just cut it down and start grazing, it just keeps pushing everything down.
Yeah.
So what are the policy alternatives? I mean, there's a human dimension to this. I mean, we sitting in our comfortable northern latitude saying, is it terrible we have to keep this rainforest intact? But there are people whose livelihood depends on cutting those trees down and doing something else with the land. I mean, on a policy level, what can you say to someone who says, well, that's fine for you, but I need a place to raise crops for my family?
Well, I think there has to be a balance. I think we have to strike a balance. I mean, I don't think that any reasonable person would say, no one should touch any forest from here on out. That's not feasible. But we can do selective logging, and we can manage these forests in a way that provide resources for humans and provide industry in which we don't completely destroy them. Because, in fact, the whole world is going to have to come to terms with this at some point, where if you keep, this is a tragedy of the commons, right? If everyone just keeps pulling trees out, well, we're all going to suffer. And so some of the more developed countries actually, well, if they want the benefits of some of these tropical resources, they may have to pay for them. And if some of those benefits are keeping them intact, well, then we may have to pay for that as well. And those types of exchanges have been set up. I mean, people have thought about this quite frequently, and this is one of the moves towards sustainable policy. Now, it's complicated because no one wants to pay for something that they're not buying, right?
Well, when we come back, we're going to take a look at a place where you all have done a fair amount of work, and that's the forest in Panama. But first, we'll take a short break. We'll be right back.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're exploring connections between the tropical forest and Wisconsin. So, you and your team do a lot of work in Panama, and talk a little bit about sort of what that forest is. I mean, I've seen references to it as the second lung, if the Amazon rainforest is the first.
Yeah, so there's a reason why we're in the Republic of Panama, and that's because when we're there, we're working actually with the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. So the Smithsonian in Washington has several big research arms, and one of them is in Panama. And so when we're there, we're actually part of this larger scientific group that's studying the forests in that region. And the forests in Panama are quite interesting. So the Panama Canal that runs through it actually runs from north to south through the center of Panama. The presence of the canal actually saved a lot of forests because the forests are so important for that watershed, and the canal, functioning of the canal, depends upon enough water coming into the canal because it's a lock canal, and so water actually flows out on both sides. And so it's something like 26 million gallons goes out with each ship. So they have to make sure they have a lot of water coming in. So they've saved all the forests. So it's actually a wonderful place to work. And we've been working there for a long time. We've established these large-scale experimental manipulations where we're looking at how different plants compete. And we know a lot about the forest now, so it's becoming a very productive place for us to work.
And is there anything particular to that forest versus other places you've looked at in terms of competition and some of these impacts that we've talked about?
Well, all forests are a little bit different. But we don't think that this forest is much different in terms of the competition that's occurring. We think that what we're studying in Panama we can apply generally to tropical forests that are similar to this. Now, many people think that tropical forests are always wet and always raining, but in fact that's not true. Most forests are seasonal, where they have a dry season that's 3 or 4 months. In Panama, it happens to be from January until May, so if you're thinking about a vacation in Panama, that's a good time. And it's quite a nice place. This time of year, in October, November, it rains a lot. You can get almost a meter of rain per month during
This time of the year. Yeah.
October, November, part of December. So you get really heavy rains in the latter part of the year and very little rain in the first part of the year. So the systems in which we're trying to compare these Panamanian forests are ones that are also seasonal, and that happens to be, fortunately for us, most of the tropical forests in the world are seasonal like that.
Well, and particular to Panama, there are, I think, some other threats that perhaps we haven't talked about, one of them being the presence of oil. Now, is that impacting things?
Wow.
Well, the presence of oil is always a problem, and this has happened again and again in the tropics, where there's a lot of oil. There is a lot of money to be made, and people will exploit that oil. In Panama, one of the big things that's happening in addition to oil is copper mining. And so there's a lot of discussion about this, but in the end, it seems that industry always takes their cut, and I think what you need to do is to mitigate damage, right? You can't tell people don't exploit this natural resource because they're going to do it because there's too much money to be made. And so I think the job of many scientists and conservation biologists is to see how we can work with these organizations to mitigate the damage to the forests that are really important for not just the wildlife, but also for carbon storage, which we discussed earlier.
Yeah, and there are also companies nowadays are interested in doing this kind of mitigations. It's just part of good business, right? They don't want to look. They don't want to be seen by the public or by their buyers and as a bad company, right? As a company that is destroying the forests somewhere around the world. And globalization has helped to distribute rapidly critical information like this. So, for example, there was a copper mine that wanted to open, and they were not complying with a lot of regulations, not only Panamanian regulations, but international regulations. And I mean, bad publicity stopped the process. So certainly, this is not going to stop. This process, first of all, it needs to be slowed down while we realize that we don't need so many things to live. I mean, that comes as an individual response. If I realize that I don't need all these many objects, well, less oil needs to be sucked out of the soil, and less copper needs to be mined out. And this is going to progressively increase people's awareness, and forests are probably going to be less logged and less deforested through time.
You're telling me I don't need that exotic wood coffee table in my home after all?
Only if it's recycled.
Well, you know, one of the questions is, you know, how do you make trees worth more alive than dead? And to what extent is that going?
Well, that's a great question, actually, and part of our research is moving towards that, right? So by quantifying the contribution of trees and how much they're growing per year and converting that to carbon, we can then start to equate the value of these trees to how much carbon they're pulling out of the air. And David's developing some really like innovative sensor networks in which we can use these to precisely measure tree growth diurnally, like during the day, from day to day, we can see them swell and shrink. And so currently what people are doing is they put these bands around a tree, and you have to go back and measure them every month or 6 months, and you're measuring them manually. But what David's producing is fully automated wireless technology that does it itself. And you can speak more about that, because it really will allow us to quantify the value of trees and how important they are to us and the global carbon cycle.
Yeah, I guess the big problem that I saw is they have these bands, and you know, how much can one person differentiate, like a millimeter or something like that. So you don't necessarily know. You have to trek, you know, miles into the rainforest and do thousands and thousands of trees. Where if you can set up a network that just brings all the data to one point and logs it for you with sensors that are very sensitive and very specific, it allows you to constantly monitor what's going on, and that's a good way to, it's like you were saying, like put value to a tree. How much you can see, like its total, like how much carbon it's bringing in, how much it's growing, how much you can see just productivity due to like the swelling from uptake of water and then shrinking from photosynthesis.
So I guess that gets to the sort of bottom line question. You know, there's sort of the more esoteric, we like rainforests because God made them and they should always be here. And then there's the much more pragmatic self-interest. How do you get that message out that, yes, indeed, sitting in Wisconsin or sitting wherever, this is really important to you?
Well, I mean, it all boils down to education. I mean, the more we understand the world around us, the more we can make these linkages, right? And it's not intuitive that something that's happening thousands of miles away is going to affect us directly. But, you know, the world is an ever-shrinking place. And we now know that the feedbacks from the oceans and the lakes that are right next to Milwaukee and the tropical forests are not that far apart. And so these things are all coming together to give us the weather that we're seeing. And we can say in Wisconsin we're pretty lucky because we have this big body of water. It's never too hot. It's never too cold. But what will happen in the future is if we don't get a handle on some of the greenhouse gas emissions is that the unpredictability will increase. We'll get much stronger storms, we'll get much stronger droughts, and that's going to have an effect over the long run. So I think that we can start to make these linkages across ecosystems to really mitigate the planet from ourselves.
So we've got just about a minute left. If I actually have gotten this message and I care about such matters, what can I do as just a citizen here?
Well, I think first of all, it's learn about all these interconnectivity between what you do here and the repercussions of that somewhere else. That can be, and the information out in the web, books, TV is available for everyone now. And I think that is a great opportunity. First of all, just if you don't know and if you're curious, just get educated. That's one thing. Second of all, once you know this, and then you can start asking yourselves, what is the consequence of my actions into my ecosystem around me, and also how that's going to repercute in some other areas of the world. But also, it's just to know that tropical forests, despite the fact that they're really far away from us here in Wisconsin, they're doing something for us. They're doing something for us that we need to understand and we need to appreciate. And if you can, if anyone out there wants to help, you can help organizations that protect forests, researchers that are doing research now there to protect them. So not only knowing, but just proactivity into that.
Very good. Well, Stefan, Sergio, David, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank
To our
you.
viewers,
Yeah.
we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,